With that being said, I would like to introduce Jillian Post. Jillian is an experienced process facilitator with content expertise in diversity, equity, inclusion, and conflict resolution principles. She also develops curriculum for projects and serves in several educator roles throughout Nebraska. Jillian attended Creighton University, where she received a master's degree in conflict resolution. Jillian thoroughly enjoys helping people find better ways to communicate, and we truly appreciate her taking the time to share her knowledge and passion with us today. And with that, Jillian, I will turn everything over to you.
Thanks, Dana. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jillian, and I do want to remind everyone that this webinar today is going to be recorded. You do have some options for whether or not you want in other contexts, in other meeting formats, you have some options to whether you want your video to be present and your voices to be heard. Today, it will be recorded. So if there is any objection that you have to having your voice recorded, you'll want to just submit your questions in the Q&A box. Just wanted to make that little note. So I've entitled this workshop a micro workshop on microaggressions and other communication topics, because in our work contexts and in our communities, I think that we have been hearing some things that might be offensive and objectionable to many of us, and we're not quite sure how to handle those things in our work contexts, in our communities. So we're going to take a little bit of an exploration on this topic and include some other things that are relevant to that topic. We want to do a quick tech check and make sure your audio is working. You can use the chat box to for any tech-related questions. We'll use the Q&A box for content-related questions, and that will be addressed a little bit later in the webinar. But if you're having any issues at all with your audio, or if you need help with Zoom in any way, please use the chat box, and we'll try and help you as best we can. Sometimes we have access to a raise your hand feature, and in other contexts, we can always raise our hand to the webcam, but there's no webcam today. We can't see your images. So again, please use the raise a hand feature or the chat box to help us understand if you need help. Some of the things that you see down here are just features that Zoom has. A lot of us have been on Zoom a lot lately, so I think we're all starting to figure those things out. But please let us help you if you need some questions answered, tech questions anyway. This webinar today is just going to be a brief introduction to a few concepts. And they're meant to help you be more mindful about the various ways that you communicate, work culture, work context, even family members, if that's what has been creating some challenges for you. And it's really only a beginning to becoming more inclusive. And that's kind of our goal, is to learn how to be more appreciative of diversity and to be a more inclusive person. We do have some learning objectives for today. We're going to briefly explore the history of inclusive language, and we'll look at some concepts that have become really outdated, some words, I should say. We're going to define what we mean by inclusive or identity-based language. We will look at some words that we've come to understand as microaggressions. And as I mentioned, we're going to take a closer look at the connotation of a previously accepted term. Just kind of an out there kind of term that hasn't been around for a while, but we're going to make sure that we look at how it's progressed through its, in terms of its usage. We're going to discuss some communication models for actually addressing microaggressions in your workplaces and various cultures. We're going to examine what specifically what these communication models look like, and then actually the verbiage for how you might address those. And then we'll try and answer some questions. I do also want to mention that this is an information-based webinar today, and we know that times are challenging, and we hope that you have other avenues for reaching out, either face-to-face or virtually, that will support you in some of the challenges that you might be facing. If you belong to a marginalized group and you are the recipient of microaggressions, it may take a more private conversation with someone. Today will be about information and learning. I push my start button here. Time myself so I can keep myself on track. So here's a brief history, very brief. Historically, the version of English used in the United States with all its idioms and slang contains words and phrases that leave groups feeling offended and marginalized. And oftentimes, as somebody who's saying those words, we scarcely think about the impact or we have an intent that we hope comes across, but in fact, the impact is different. And change, when we go about changing the words we use and the ways that we communicate, it's never easy. Change is never easy. It's one of the hardest things for human beings to deal with, because it asks that we try and examine these deeply embedded habits and consider the implications of our words and phrases that have long gone unchallenged. It asks that we dig deep into our own ability to empathize, which is difficult in and of itself, and we have to imagine an experience that's not our own. So we like to think about inclusive or identity-based language when we're trying to engage and communicate with people. This person or identity-first language creates and maintains an environment of, hopefully, of dignity, respect, and hope. Using language based on identity is also a more accurate way of speaking about someone. It helps eliminate stereotypes that can form. So, for instance, saying someone is transgendered, just make a slight shift and change that to a person who is transgender, a person who is in a wheelchair, a person who belongs to this community or that community. So like much of our learning, rarely is there an absolute consensus. You're going to find a lot of dialogue and conversation about what is right and what is wrong, if there is such a thing. Some people like to be identified as Black, and some as African American. That's one example. If you talk to someone, they might be adamant about what term they would like to use, and you respect that and use that term. Some feel more included and empowered by their identity, so it's more important to them. So a person with a total hearing loss, here's another instance, might refer to themselves as deaf. That's deaf with a capital D. So they belong to the deaf community. However, for a person diagnosed as bipolar, that would never be appropriate. You wouldn't really want to identify that. You wouldn't even want to talk about that sometimes to people. You might use that part of your identity in very specific and private contexts, but you wouldn't identify yourself that way to the public. So on the whole, this discussion is proof that language is never one size fits all. And it really is about learning how to ask respectfully how one wants to be identified. And that aspect is paramount to including to creating some kind of inclusive environment. So you may have asked yourself, or maybe you think you know, and you very well may know, what exactly is a microaggression? Succinctly, Their everyday actions, behaviors, or words that have harmful effects on marginalized groups, and they're often unconscious. They're related to the term that many of you have also heard called implicit bias or unconscious bias. When we have that at work in our lives, we're not exactly sure what kind of harm we're creating. So you see that little picture down there. This is a common thing that people do. Where are you really from? Maybe we think we know that someone has come from a different place, been born in a different country. We're making assumptions about their appearance. And so we ask that question, where are you really from? That can be one of the most offensive questions that anyone ever asks of another person, because they could be third generation, or maybe they were born here, went away for a while, moved back. Maybe their accent, that they use, we think it tells us something, but it really tells us nothing. So asking that question is not a good way to start. And here's this intent versus impact challenge that we face again, because microaggressions are not just harmless. They may seem small and tiny, but they add up. And no matter how confident people from marginalized or underrepresented communities feel about their identities, microaggressions create unsafe spaces, and they make individuals feel like perpetual outsiders. So if you're trying to create a community or a culture within your community, within your workplace, within your employee resource group, or wherever it is that you function, if you're trying to make that feel more inclusive, then you want to be mindful of the words that you use. Because you don't want your team members to feel like they're standing on the fringes. If you want full participation from them, then they need to feel like they're part of the collective. Microaggressions can be identified by problematic words and slurs. There are many of them. Here are a few. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can look at them. You can maybe recognize yourself using some of them. Let's touch on a couple. So the word powwow, the term powwow, perfectly harmless word if you are a member of an indigenous group or community and you are talking to somebody privately and you say, hey, what time's the powwow next week? Because indigenous people have this celebratory event that they call powwow. So that's cool. But if you're in a meeting context and things are getting heated, and you identify this heated conversation that you're having as a powwow, then that's cultural appropriation. Another term that you may have heard somewhere along the line. Cultural appropriation is when we co-opt something and use it in a different context where it's not meaningful and not correctly used. Another one, my personal favorite, is you guys. Wow, as a nation, in this culture, we use that term all of the time. I hear it on news broadcasts. I hear it in groups. I use it. I, mess up and use it from time to time. But you know what? If you're a person who identifies on a non-binary gender identity, continuum, then being called guys is not so cool. In especially in our work environments, if we're a leader and we're conducting some kind of training and we're constantly referring to everyone in the room as you guys, then you can create harm. You can create harm to people that are in that room. And we don't want to do that. So here's that example of us looking at a closer historical connotation that it's kind of from the old world. We don't see a lot of people using this very much anymore, but the word Oriental. If you're at an estate sale and you're talking about rugs or jewelry, yeah, that is what you're meaning to say. But, you know, in the past, the word Oriental had a connection to, you know, people that came from the East or East Asian. It's a way to describe things that come from that area of the world that we might still refer to as the Orient. It was also a word that was once used to refer to people who were either born in that sector of the world or whose ancestors were. But using Oriental as a noun is now considered offensive slang. It's even been banned from usage in federal law, as well as in a number of states, where official documents may only refer to people as Asian Americans rather than that dated term. So that's an example of kind of a term that may seem quite innocuous at times. We may use it to describe things as an adjective, but when we use that as a noun, it comes off as being offensive, and it comes off as being a slang that's not accepted anymore. So what do we do? What do we do when we are in a situation where we find this happening? We're feeling nervous about how to approach it. Maybe we have a power differential in our group, and we're really afraid of getting in trouble or somehow being looked on in a different way. Well, there's an answer to that. These communication models help us address these microaggressions. There's a couple different kinds. This private, you know, what we call more or less calling in, it actually addresses the person after the fact many times. So maybe it's not a context where you want to, you don't want to feel like you're attacking somebody, and maybe this well-intended person is shy, they've made a mistake, they just haven't learned, and you don't want to call them out in public. So it creates a space for a mistake to happen, right? And it prioritizes the relationship with that well-intended person. And it also calls into personal reflection, you know, a way to get that person to change their own behavior. So they can, after the fact, you as a person, as a leader, you know better, you want to chat with them, you call them in after the meeting or a training, and you use your best compassionate voice and you say, you know, reflect on this with me, right? That's kind of how it looks. But a public calling out situation is much different. It's when a pretty egregious type of thing happens, and you need to address it publicly and immediately, because it creates accountability, and it actually prioritizes the impacted person, the person who has been harmed by this word, and it looks out for their well-being. And it aims to get that person to stop their behavior, their problematic behavior, like immediately. So that would look more like you're in a context. There's 35 people in the room, and you know, this doesn't have to be mean, and it doesn't have to be about shame, because shame doesn't get people to change. Shame and blame never gets anyone to change their behavior. It just makes them feel like crap, quite frankly. So maybe you're in this room and there's 35 people, and somebody says, I don't know, they use a word that you know is offensive. Then you might want to say, you know what? Could you think of a better word to use there? Or, hey group, what do you think about that word? Do you think that's the word that we're still all using? Or maybe is there a better word? So that's a kind of shaky example. When you're in the context, it feels a little bit more natural and flows a little bit more readily out of your mouth, hopefully. especially if you've practiced, right? So, you know how realtors use that phrase location, location, location? Well, so I co-opted it and they used practice, practice, practice as a substitution, because you can practice with your work groups. You can practice at home, and you can actually look in the mirror and talk to yourself and figure out a way to incorporate better words and kind of incorporate how to transition out of the fumble that you just created in your work context and make it a little bit more inclusive. So I'm going to ask right now for us to use kind of a visualization technique, so an imaging technique. I want you to think about being in, I don't know, your break room at work. Close your eyes and then put yourself in that place. You're standing in the break room and you're kind of sort of outside of the conversation at this point, and two other people are talking. And they say something like, and I'm not going to use the offensive word, you can imagine what it might be. They say something like, you know, this whole virus wouldn't be a problem if it wasn't for the fill in the blank. Really offensive word. How would you talk to them? What would you say? How would you break into conversation or dialogue with them? You feel your heart beating, your pulse is racing, and you want to say something, but you're uncomfortable and uncertain. And this is what practicing is about. So here's 4 suggestions, specific suggestions, and these might help your group or people that you know, people that you've seen doing this oftentimes, too often to let it go. Here's some suggestions for how this might sound. So if we frame the confrontation, which is a word that has a negative connotation from the get-go, if we frame it in the form of a question, it might come out a little bit better. So you might say something like, so how do you feel about this identity group compared to this individual? In other words, the gist behind this is, are you stereotyping all the time, or are you just stereotyping right now? You don't want to say that. You want to say, how do you feel about this group compared to this person? Trying to get them to reflect on the individuality of a person, because our identities are very unique to us. Another thing you might do is invoke an egalitarian self-concept. So, big words. I always thought you were a little more open-minded than that. Again, getting them to personally reflect and, think about how that word may have just come across to someone. Now, when we get to know people, we find out more about them and relationships become more personalized. And then you can learn about more of the critical aspects of someone's identity, and hopefully that will also correct. You will self-correct. But for someone else, you don't know anything about that. So you just have to use these kind of generic statements to get them to self-reflect and just ask about their own concept of the world and how open-minded they might be. So you might also focus on actions and how that makes them feel, and how getting them to think about how that might make others feel. Connecting it to your own perception. So, I'm uncomfortable when you say things like that. So if you're in a meaningful relationship and that person cares about you, they don't want you to feel uncomfortable. They respect your the way your perceptions and the way you look at things. So maybe that might be a way to get a conversation or a dialogue started. I'm uncomfortable with that. Maybe that other person is too. And then we also want to remember to avoid that self-righteous and power over dynamic. So in our work context, there are so many times when the power differential plays a really important role. And we have to pay attention to that. Different organizations still have those hierarchies. Some have tried to remove the hierarchies and become more flat, more inclusive, or more circular. But the power over concept is really important. So you might say something like, with all the stereotypes that we encounter in the world, I can see how you might say that. I can see how you might still use that word, but really we should all try hard to avoid thinking that way. I don't know, what other word might you come up with that would be, clearly less offensive and would be more inclusive to these people that you may or may not know anything about. We don't want to make assumptions in this world. Assumptions cause problems. So this mini webinar was intended to give you just an introduction on how to address one communication challenge of many in the world. If you are really interested in this work, we have something coming up on September 19th. Hopefully it will be in person and on campus. It's a full one-day workshop that you will actually receive some CU hours for. Is that what I want to mean? What I want to say, Dana? Con Ed, inclusive,
Yeah, CEUs, continuing education units.
Yes, there you go. It's called Being Radically Inclusive. It's not so radical. And if you're searching for it, you want to use the keyword inclusive. Like I said, it's currently slated for the first date is September 19th. I think then October 20th, November and December. We'll see how it goes. We'll see how many people we get signed up. But it is interactive. You will come away from it with tools and sharing. You will be asked to make a reflective journal. We'll have a circle dialogue. It's going to be very powerful. So you might want to think about just expanding your version or your knowledge of this particular concept and the way you relate it in your work cultures and communities. That is what I have for now. We're probably ahead of the game, and I want to leave a lot of time for questions because I really believe that people have a lot of questions about this topic. This is kind of a narrow, parameter that we're using today just to talk about basically these 3 or 4 different things. And you probably have your own experiences at work and a lot of questions, and we want to hear them, and I'll do my best to answer them. So let's see what's out there. I'm going to stop.
You do have a couple in the Q&A box, Jillian.
Okay.
And then I am actually going to go through and let everyone allow to speak. So I'm going to give everybody access to their audio.
Okay.
If you do not want me to do that, just shoot me a quick note in the chat box. And
I think also, Dana, they can choose to remute themselves if they want to as well. So
correct.
I just want to put up here, I want to be sure to thank you. I don't want to forget to thank you for your participation today as we engage here a little bit. And this is me. This is my card. This is what I do. And I'll put that back up there maybe at the end. But for now, I'm gonna take this down, and Dana's gonna help me try and answer. Get us connected.
Absolutely. So everyone now does have control over their audio. So if you just have to unmute yourself if you have a question you would like to ask Jillian. I'm going to go through, we have a couple. of things in the Q&A box. I'm going to read to Jillian, and then she will answer those, and then we can just keep taking questions.
Okay.
So the first one, Jillian, is to say that would never be appropriate, bipolar. Would that not add to the stigma of mental health? I do not like never in that sentence.
Good point. Yeah. So, but the thing is, we don't want to assume. We don't want to assume that that is appropriate. So that would take a private conversation, right? Maybe somebody, that is, I don't think mental health is ever a part of anyone's identity, but it's that they're going to share. I mean, we can look at in a different context and different workshops. So we've looked at the dimensions of diversity and our how we identify is part of that, but to just assume that someone's going to talk about a challenge that they're having, I don't know. But you've got a point. You've got a point, and never say never. I agree. I stand corrected.
Okay. Is microaggression harassment?
I don't know. Do we all think it is? It is. It doesn't go to the level of harassment. That's why it's called a microaggression. And I've in my studies, I've seen the term now macroaggression, which might be more attuned to harassment. But I don't think a microaggression is harassment. I think a microaggression is a slight, slur, jab, joke, things that, like I said, many times people do not, they don't even recognize it. So I would think that there's malice involved with harassment. But a microaggression, many times there isn't malice involved. And that's why it's so sneaky. That's why it's so hard to identify and hard for us to reflect upon ourselves and why we need to learn about, what is and what isn't. Well, many things are. And if you have a question in your mind as to whether something is, it probably is.
If I haven't witnessed the microaggression in a person, how can you help someone become aware of the damage they have caused a student?
Okay, so I actually have the box
in person. If
Yeah,
I haven't witnessed the microaggression in person.
I have the box up here now. I'm going to reread that. If I haven't witnessed the microaggression in person, how can you help someone become aware of the damage they have caused a student? Well, you know what? If you haven't witnessed in person, then you don't know for sure what exactly happened. But if somebody has communicated with you, like maybe another student has, emailed you and said, I saw this happen the other day and it really bothered me. And I'm pretty sure that it was a microaggression. And I'm pretty sure that I saw some nonverbal communication from the harmed person that would indicate that it did not go over well with them, right? Oh man, open up a dialogue first with the person who's trying to be the kind of secondary call out person, right? I didn't actually see it, but I know that I have to deal with it. Open up a dialogue with that person and then try and expand it to the actual harmed person. Check in with them respectfully, using as much inclusive language as you can possibly muster. Be inquisitive, ask open-ended questions, and open-ended questions and those basic conflict resolution skills. That's a whole nother workshop that I've actually included in my repertoire as well. So that's a whole nother thing that we as human beings need to work on and learn. But definitely you want to not ignore it. And you want to first start with the person who contacted you and then see if you're in an appropriate situation where you can contact that person who maybe has been identified or maybe not. If they haven't been identified, then you just have to work on your skills and hope that it doesn't happen again. But I would definitely open up a dialogue and use very respectful, curious, inclusive language to start that dialogue.
What about people not in a marginalized group? Can they be a target of microaggression? Is everyone part of a marginalized group?
What a great question. So I wish I had my dimensions of diversity slides up right now, because we could talk about and really become more comfortable with recognizing all the various parts of our identities. We have what religion we belong to, or ethnicity, nationality, you know, various work groups that we belong to or don't belong to, our race, our gender identity. I mean, there's so many parts of our identities, and they layer upon one another in this concept of intersectionality, which manifests all the systems of advantage and in creating oppressive, behavior. And so I'm getting I'm including words that maybe you've heard of or not heard of, but I believe that I believe that everybody probably has one aspect of their identity that would be defined as marginalized, or marginalized or oppressed in some way, or a minority. All of those words are somewhat interchangeable. So my loosey-goosey, weird, all over the place answer to your question is, yeah, but I think you have to look at the identities, the distinct identities, aspects of your identity, and you'll realize that almost all of us belong to some marginalized group in some context. If you really look at all the dimensions of your diversity labelings, the words we use to describe all the ways that we are diverse in this world. But we really want to make an important emphasis on the fact that in this country, particularly right now, the aspects of our identity that are front and center, the color of our skin, whether or not we have a disability, those things are clear, demonstrators of marginalization. And so those are the people that we really want to pay special attention to. But don't feel like that, if you're experiencing harm, look back and see whether you are part of a marginalized group. And then you'll understand how it can work in so many different ways.
What is the most, oh,
Go ahead.
what is the most appropriate way to address a person who is disabled generally?
Ask them. Get to know them. Even if it's in a very very present moment. Maybe you're just having an engagement with them at the door of a store or something. I'm having visualizations right now. You're at a store. There's a revolving door, and somebody who does have a disability, a person who does have a disability is really having a hard time negotiating everything. And you certainly want to walk up to them and say, well, I realize since you have a disability, you probably need some help. Not cool. Just go up to them. You don't really need to figure out what label they use or don't use until you get into a personal dialogue and conversation with them. And then you just use that manner of respect that I was referring to earlier. Like, by the way, tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell me about the different aspects of your identity and what you like to be referred to as. What's comfortable for you? There is no general way. There is no general way to approach anyone about anything. We want to get in a space, even if it's very limited, We want to get in a space where we can, with respect, in the appropriate way, find out a little bit more about them and what's comfortable for them. That's a roundabout answer, but
I think of microaggression as little digs that make me feel stupid. Is that correct?
yeah, certainly is. We in the workshops that I've done, we always refer to it as jokes, jabs, slurs, words, things like that. Anything that just gets under your skin and causes you to pull back from a group. You might not even recognize it until, okay, so as the person who has someone do that to them, you may not instantly recognize it as a microaggression. You may just all of a sudden feel a pit in your stomach. You may all of a sudden feel less like participating. You may all of a sudden feel like, you may all of a sudden feel some anger mounting in your chest and your throat. As the person who is doing that to someone, you may be home later in the evening thinking about the word that you've used. People, I've done this. We've all done it. We've been standing there, getting ready or doing something, and we might think to ourselves, oh my gosh, I did not use the right word. Dana, in a workshop that we did a few weeks ago, I actually found myself using the word totem pole because it's just in my vocabulary. And, when you think about the hierarchy, and I just slipped out of my mouth. I said, if you're the low guy on the totem pole, gosh, that's like really bad. And I self-corrected immediately in the moment. But there are other times when we may not. And we might have to think about that a little bit. So, look for those nonverbals from people. And then, if you are the microaggressor, and if you are the microaggressee, if we may use that term, look for what it does to your body. Oftentimes, it will just make you feel a slight bit of repulsion in the moment.
This person uses microaggressions very, very often as a way to assert power.
Oh gosh, that's so common. That is so common. It is so common to have somebody who, why do people use power moves in the first place? They use power moves maybe because they don't feel very powerful. Maybe. So if they use a microaggression to assert their power, that's their little, that is their little way to get by with it. And they just hope and pray that all of you out there haven't had any training and that all of you out there won't even notice and that you won't call them out. And this is what this workshop is about. Because if we're going to change our nation, if we're going to change our cultures, our subcultures, our work cultures, and our communities, then we have to begin finding a way to address this. Sometimes in the moment and sometimes after the fact.
Is it okay to have small talk with people and ask where they live?
Yes, of course. But check yourself. Check yourself before you say that, before you ask that. I don't know, and visualize a situation, a dialogue that you're having with somebody, and they look exactly like you, and you're not making any assumptions, and you just want to know where you're currently living, what's your historical context. I don't know, there's no consensus about how you really have to check in with that person. But here's what we don't want to do. Let's say somebody starts at your workplace and they're dressed in hijab, right? They have a head covering, they have a headscarf. Maybe they don't have any accent at all, but you, in your unconscious mind, and we do this all the time, the first thing out of our mouth is, where did you move from? Or, you know, what's your religion? Or are you this? Or are you that? Now, that's the wrong thing to do. So, yeah, we're going to have private conversations, small conversations with people. Just practice. Think about the best way to word that so that you're not just coming across as somebody who's trying to put them in a box from the get-go. Does that make sense? I hope so.
Okay, so we have important note related to the term transgendered used in this presentation. While I know firsthand it is a hard habit to break, it has become generally accepted in the LGBT community that the ED on the identity label should not be used when referring to a person who is transgender. The idea is that the ED suggests it is something that has happened to them as opposed to something that they are, which is transgender.
Bridget, you hit the nail on the head. That is exactly what it's about. Little story. So in a previous role, I was director of education somewhere, and I had to create a sign-up tool and a registration form. This was years ago, you know, when we were just starting to talk about all of this and trying to adjust the language that we use and the terms that we use and the approaches that we used. And I mean, it's ever changing, which is why it's good to do a workshop every so often and have conversations, really frank conversations with people, you know, dialogues with people where you're allowed to ask and explore. But I created this registration form, and I put, I have to think about this a second, I put preferred pronoun, because I wanted my parents and their children to include that. So I want, as a way to be inclusive, I wanted to include that on the registration form. Now that's controversial from the get-go. Some people just don't even want to be asked that. It's private. They're not out. They don't even want to talk about it. But it is their choice to include it or not. But I had put preferred pronoun. And then I read some more and I thought about it some more and I decided that is an inference that is wrong. It's not, we don't prefer our pronoun. I mean, our pronoun might change, but it's not something we prefer. It's something we are, right? So if we identify as on a binary, then we might use they, and that is our pronoun. It's not what we prefer today, and then we prefer something else tomorrow. So that kind of relates to what Bridget just talked about, where it's not, you know, it's not something that's happened to them. It's something they are. Do we have other questions, Dana? I'm gonna scroll down.
You guys is a very common phrase in the Midwest. What's a good substitution?
Boy, this is something we wrestle with all the time. But when I'm in a group, I've actually done pretty good. I've actually done pretty good to retrain myself. And I just say everybody. Sometimes if I'm feeling kind of Southern, I say y'all. A lot of people from the South say y'all. But you could say, how does the group feel? How does everybody feel? How do the persons in the room feel? You know, it's very contextual, obviously, but if you really start thinking about it and you ding yourself every time that happens to you, you know, like Pavlov and the psychological conditioning, you know, you will learn to retrain yourself and stay away from that. I personally, it is my pet peeve. I hear it really, I hear it from news anchors a lot. Hey, you guys. And it's just like, let's do better, right? Let's try and do better.
And it is hard. That is, you guys and crazy are two terms that I've been trying to focus on because those I use a lot. And it really is hard because sometimes when I want to go, like, oh my gosh, that's totally crazy. Like, I'll have to be like, oh my gosh, this totally, and then I have to pause to think of another word. It's,
And you're like choking on your words, and you know, you're like, oops, yeah.
yeah. And you can't even really say nuts or, and so it's kind of, um, but it is hard when you challenge yourself to not say you guys then you really realize how much you use it.
Yep.
So it's kind of hard, but it's been good.
As with everything, it starts with awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think we have one last question here from Jennifer. If they are using a microaggression to assert power, is it still a microaggression or is it just aggression? Yeah. So I just mentioned that in some learning environments, they actually have identified, the difference between a microaggression and a macroaggression. I don't even know if that's accurate. It might just be aggression. But it's not that simple, because somebody can, let's say you're in a 2-hour training. And you know what? Let's give people let's cut them a little bit of slack, because we're all in this learning environment together. And if somebody is using malice, it's clear. They know what they're doing. They should know better. No, that's not right. Let's take the word should out. They're a leader. They've had training. They've spoken on it before. They've represented themselves as being an inclusive person. And now they've switched into this power mode, and they used a microaggression to belittle you. Then no, it's not a microaggression. It's a power play. So they're all kind of jumbled together, and it's hard to pick out these things and figure out what is what and the intention behind people. That's why we talk so much about intent and impact, because our intent might be harmless, but our impact is very harmful. So it's kind of all over the board, and each context is very individualized and takes some reflection on the part of the person who's being harmed and the person who's doing the harm. This is why we want to become better citizens, better people. Take a look, take a deep dive. Sometimes you'll do it in a group like this together, where we can explore. And I personally like to have, a meeting, but we had 35 people today, so that's a little bit harder to take around and actually have full participation, so we decided to keep it a webinar. But be a leader, start a conversation, be the person who has practiced and you don't want to mince words, and you don't want to censor yourself, but you really want to come to a place where you've got a little bit more comfort with the topic.
We have another question. Can microaggression to assert power be intimidation? Should intimidation by a supervisor or person in power be reported?
The short answer is absolutely yes. Again, so contextual, because I can't remember what workshop it was, Dana, but we talked about, or maybe it wasn't even for Southeast Community College. We talked about different levels of danger. That's pretty harsh, but levels of danger in a situation. If you're a person whose identity is made up of so many marginalized, aspects. I mean, let's say you're African American, you're transgender, you're a person you're a person who uses a wheelchair. You have all of those things, and you feel so unpowerful, but you must keep your job. You have to keep your job. Then if you're being intimidated and you have an HR person who's not responsive, are you going to go to them? I mean, you may not. You really may need to talk to somebody in a smaller group, or a trusted friend, or a therapist. I mean, there's just so many different ways to successfully or unsuccessfully handle these situations. I'm going to read this question again. Can microaggression to assert power be intimidation? It can be intimidating, but I don't think it's meant to be intimidation. I don't think a person who does a microaggression, I don't think they often know exactly the power they have. And the second part of that question, again, to repeat, is should intimidation by a supervisor or person in power be reported? You know, maybe it can't be reported, but it absolutely should be fleshed out and talked about and addressed with a trusted person. Otherwise, it's gonna build up and cause some sort of wound that will continue to fester.
Okay. Well, we have about 4 more minutes. I don't know if anyone has any other questions they want to pop into the chat box or in the Q&A box, or you're welcome to also verbally ask your questions too.
I see a question in the chat box. September 19th is the full day seminar. That's a Saturday. Yes, it is a Saturday. Dana and I have been working together to try and figure out the best day of the week for people. For a 1 day, all day, it's 7 hours workshop, and I have my own calendar challenges that I am negotiating, like many of us now. So much is changing, and you know, we're trying to fit all the puzzle pieces together. And so I decided to go with Saturday. It's for the September, and then we're going to try a Tuesday for October, and then back to Saturday for November, and back to Saturday in December, early in December, so it doesn't get into the season. So yeah, and I hope we have some folks, because you're going to start by learning, and then you're going to get into some personal reflection, and then you're going to come together as a group, and we're actually going to use a talking stick. We're going to use a circle dialogue where people will get to share, and they will get to talk about things that they have had happen to them, or that things that they know they've done. They'll get to talk about your things you've witnessed in your own family that have literally changed your perceptions and made you who you are. So I'm really looking forward to it, and I hope we can go forward with it. So I just want to again thank all of you for participating today and for your excellent questions. This is the webinar. This is the second iteration of this webinar, and every time I do it, I change a little bit and add a little bit, and you know, this is the state of things right now. We're in a state of perpetual change and perpetual readdressing of things. So I think that brings us to the conclusion. Dina, do you have anything you want to add, or?
I do not. I just want to thank again everybody for joining us today. I hope everybody had a good takeaway, which I'm sure you did. I do every time I watch it. I always learn something new. So yeah, we hope to
just remember that we're all in learning mode. It doesn't matter how much education you've had, or how many workshops you've taught, or how many different contexts you've been in. There's still much to be learned, and everything's changing. So just keep your minds open, keep your hearts and your minds open, and have a great rest of your week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.